Now, one of the things that I talked about last week that I hinted at I was going to mention today is I want you to think about your favorite map of all time. And while you're thinking about that, I'm going to share my favorite map of all time. This is actually not a new map. It's fairly new, but it came out in 1992. It looks like a satellite image, but it was actually the first digital landforms map. So in the past, we had lots of quite skilled cartographers that would make shaded relief maps by hand with little, for example, air guns that were not much more big than a size of an oversized pen, and would shoot little dots of ink onto a map, onto usually a piece of film or vellum or something like that, and they would reproduce that into pieces of paper that you and I could buy. Anyway, each one of those individual ink dots gave them a sense of, if I put more ink dots over in the lee side of the mountains, those mountains are going to look like they're tall mountains. So shaded relief was actually done by hand. This was the very first digital shaded relief. So it was made by all of those USGS contour maps that probably many of you have used in the past for hiking and so on, that the USGS made for decades and decades and decades. And this map is intriguing, I think, for that reason, because it was the very first digital seamless map. Another reason why I like it is there's no imprints on there. There's no cultural features, cities, there's cities, towns, roads, and there's no text on it. So you can really see the shading and the landforms. That's the whole purpose. They want people to see, the people that made this, Gail Thielen and Richard Pike, that these landforms are oftentimes subtle, and sometimes they're missed if you're on the landscape. You don't really see some of these things. More about that in a moment. But I just love this one. So I'll put it in the chat box. This is the higher resolution version of it. And of course, there's a whole report that talks about, here it is, that map and how it's made. But we don't have time to really get into that here. But basically, it was made by stitching together or mosaicing. Some of you might be quilters. It's mosaicing a bunch of quilts together, that each individual quilt square, if you will, was a topographic map with the contour lines on it and was merged together. But one of the things that I like about it is that you can see things that are really quite detailed, even though it's a USA 48 states map. For example, over here in California, you can see this part right here in the Central Valley, in the Sacramento Valley. You've got Sutter Buttes that are right here where I'm pointing my mouse. It's not very prominent on the landscape when you're actually in the Central Valley, but here on this shaded relief map, it looks pretty prominent. Why? Because the surrounding valley, as many of you know by being in the Central Valley, it is one of the flattest places in the country. A lot of people don't think that there's a place in California that flat until you're actually in Bakersfield or Fresno. Maybe some of you have been there, and it is flat. And that's one of the reasons why it's been so wonderful to grow grapes and figs and cabbage and all the other stuff. Probably a lot of it was actually in the grocery store that you went to last week, right? It's a huge agricultural area. And another thing that I like about this is notice, let's zoom out just a little bit. Notice how large the Great Basin is, right? The Great Basin is that area between West Texas and pretty much Southeast Oregon. It stretches a huge distance. So basically from El Paso all the way up to Southeast Oregon. The Basin and Range province, where you've got these ranges of these fault block mountains and these playas or flatland between the mountains. So some of you have been across US 50, I-80 in Nevada, et cetera, and you just marvel at this. And also the interesting thing about the Great Basin, of course, is that there's no external drainage, right? That's why it's called the Great Basin. Everything drains into it. There's no exit for water. So it's an interesting area, and it's just huge. Really, I think a lot of people don't think about that. The other thing that I wanted to point out is this area right up here. Doesn't it look like something big divided right there where I'm pointing my mouse? Something like huge went across the landscape. What would that be? Does anybody have access to the chat box? What would that be? What divided right there where I'm pointing my mouse?
Mississippi River.
Debbie from Iowa is not allowed to answer this one because I know she knows the answer. Exactly. It's the continental glaciation. So the two lobes of the last glaciation divided right there at the Coteau de Praire. I'm probably not pronouncing the French word correctly, but the Coteau de Praire. And another nice thing about that, a fascinating thing, is that if you're in northeastern, but person that talked about the Mississippi River, you can see that etched in on this part of the map as well. But anyway, the point is right here, if you're up in northeastern South Dakota, it doesn't look that prominent on the landscape. It looks like a low ridge, but it doesn't look as prominent. So sometimes scale actually matters in mapping. Sometimes you see patterns at certain scales that you don't see at other scales. We talked a little bit about scale last time, but I love that, being able to look at that. This, by the way, we'll look over here for a bit. Speaking of glaciation, this is the Driftless area in Wisconsin, okay? The Driftless Area. Some of you may know this. It is part of western Wisconsin and a bit of northeast Iowa and a bit of southeast Minnesota. Anyway, the point is the Wisconsin glaciation divided right there as well. And so you've got this etching of river valleys there where the glaciation didn't bulldoze and make everything flatter like it did on the surrounding area. Really fascinating. You can see the etching of the Mississippi River and the Wisconsin River in there. Great canoe country. There's the Sparta Elroy bike trail, all kinds of interesting terrain there. Very hilly, of course, as you can see. So, and then the last thing that I'll share about this, and I promise to leave this one alone, but you're welcome to look at these folding and faulting of the Appalachians. I love that. Some of you have been to Pennsylvania and West Virginia. But one of the reasons why I like to show this, especially for students out west, like here in Colorado, is because a lot of students think of everything east of Denver as this sort of flat, barren wasteland until you get to the Appalachians. I mean, that's sort of the prevailing notion of a lot of students of all ages here in the West. And I like to show this map as, okay, that's not exactly true. Sure, if you don't get off I-70, that's part of the problem. You need to get out into the blue highways, William Least Heat Moon, which is one of my favorite geography books, blue highways. You need to get off those interstate highways onto these blue, smaller state and US highways. So if you just take a look at east of Denver here, Denver being right over here where the South Platte, you can kind of trace it down here in the Front Range right in here. You've got the Palmer Divide, which divides the South Platte drainage from the Arkansas drainage in Colorado, and all kinds of fascinating things. The Flint Hills in Kansas, the Sand Hills in Nebraska, the hills and valleys of Iowa, you know, the Ozarks. There's a lot going on. Okay, it's a different kind of paying attention to detail than you have out west. Sure, it's a different kind of landscape. And what I'm trying to do, you know, in my own work, and hopefully you can be partners with me on this, is to instill a love of geography, instill really getting out there and looking at your surroundings with all five senses, et cetera. So there's a lot of variety between, if you follow the 39° north parallel line of latitude all the way from Denver to Virginia, there's a lot of variety there. It's not just boring nothingness until you get to the Appalachians. Right, Debbie? Anyway, the point is there's a lot going on there. So the I-2206 digital landforms of the US map. Remember last time I made this case for, hey, we've got rising awareness of geographic issues. We've got people enabled to use tools like Google Maps to find their way across campus or to the nearest public library or to your grandmother's house or wherever. The geotechnologies having evolved into this cloud-based environment. We talked about it's great that you have music on the cloud. It's great that you have documents that you can share with colleagues in the cloud, but it's even better to have these tools and data sets that we use to make smarter and wiser decisions. And I, again, tried to make the case where if we're going to try to solve these 21st century issues, we've got to be able to collaborate across disciplines, across country boundaries, across physical boundaries like landforms behind me. And then citizen science. So people collecting data on birds or pine beetle infestation or water quality or litter in their community or whatever it is, and mapping it and then analyzing it is huge. And didn't I bring up that walkability map of mine last time? Someone remind me if I showed you that or not. Map of walkable neighborhoods. Then I might do that today. That's an example of citizen science. And finally, storytelling with maps. And we'll talk about that right now, actually. About the hailstorm. Geography matters, right? Weather events. I mean, once again, geography has a big role. Storytelling with maps. Now, maps have always been used to tell stories, rich and deep stories. Maps have always been a lot of information in a short amount of space, whether that space was stone tablets, right? Babylonian clay tablet. You can look at that. I went to the British Museum once, and there's this Babylonian clay tablet. That's one of the oldest known maps. It's about this big, and there was a map of Babylon. Then wood blocks. Al-Idrisi's map on silver in the 1100s that he made for King Roger of Sicily. That would have been great to see. Unfortunately, when the Phoenicians came in, destroyed Carthage, that there went the map on silver. But we have records that it actually existed. They probably melted it down for weapons. I don't know what they did with it, but it's too bad it wasn't preserved. But this huge 2 maps on tons of silver. silver plate that was pounded into a thin substance where people could actually, where Al-Idrisi could actually etch the map on. So silver, wood blocks, but then in more modern times on film, beginning in the early 20th century, maps were actually made on film. So all those USGS topo maps that I mentioned earlier, those were largely etched onto film, first copper plates, then on film, and then the film was used to reproduce the paper copies. So that was all done by hand, very laborious. And that's, again, why only a few select people were actually cartographers that made these maps. Nowadays, we've got the democratization of mapping, right? Where you and I and your friends and your family members can actually make some of these maps. More about that in a moment. But story maps are one manifestation of storytelling with maps. Let me show you a few story maps. First of all, story maps they're on the web. They are multimedia maps with audio, video, text, photographs, etc., and live interactive web maps as we've seen inside them. And they are about 2 million in number now. There have been 2 million story maps made over the last 10 years. Why? Because they're very compelling. People can actually create them fairly easily, and they tell a story, so they're compelling. And so people make these, people, organizations, government agencies, private individuals, academia, school kids, a wide sector of society makes these story maps. Let me show you a few of these. This is one on another topic that I'm sure is taught in the academy, and that is on climate and weather. So this is about climate change. How and why is it changing? What can we do about it? So this is a story map. You can see from the little scroll bar in the upper right here, and I'm going to put this in the chat box so you can explore it more on your own, is very small, meaning that the map is very long, actually. It's one of the longer story maps that I know of. But this gives you an example of what a story map is. It has video, it has this immersive sort of experience. Oftentimes you've got imagery, as you can see here. It's got interactive, of course, maps, graphs, charts, infographics inside the story map. Now here's an example of the embedding of a live interactive web map inside a story map. So if I said, hey, I want to find out what's going on, in a certain country, the biocapacity reserve, what does that mean? Okay, let's go to, remember what I talked about last time, the metadata for the map, the information behind the map. Remember last time I really strongly, as much as I could, gently advocated that you be a critical consumer of maps. Don't just accept anything you see on the web, of course, and don't just accept any map you see, because anybody can create a map. So maps are very useful, and I don't want you to shy away from maps. I want you to embrace them, but again, always ask who created it, at what scale, what was their purpose, how often is it updated, etc. Okay, I never metadata I didn't like. That was a little geo pun. I never the metadata is the information about the map or the satellite image or whatever it is. So this is the hot numbers story map. I'll show you another one that I frequently use because I love history is just as much as geography. This is a story map on the Titanic. So nothing wrong with a book on the Titanic or a movie on the Titanic or a web page on the Titanic or an article on the Titanic. Nothing wrong with any of those things. But I would just argue that maps have this way of helping you understand something, in this case, an event, a ship, an event, etc., in a richer, deeper way, in some ways, than you wouldn't get from some of those other mediums. So in this case, for example, it shows, again, why maps are powerful and why story maps are powerful. So in this case, you see the sort of interactivity between the map and the graph. So speaking of the graph, you got the grim details on the left side with the pie chart. Now this is just passengers. It's not the crew, so we know that already. But what about the difference between first class? You probably know what's coming next, right, folks? Second class, and then the grim details. If you were in third class, your chances of survival are what, 1 in 4? And remember what I talked about last time as well. Maps oftentimes confirm our sort of predisposed or conceived notion of how the world works. And sometimes maps challenge our preconceived notion of how the world works. In this case, for me, having read a lot about this and created my own, mapping based lessons on the Titanic, where students actually dig into where did it sink, why did the icebergs flow from the Davis Strait on down to the Grand Banks. Here's the Grand Banks right here, etc. So, but even so, I was challenged because I didn't realize until looking at this map that look at how many people were on that ship from Scandinavia and Southeast Europe. Okay, not as much as from the USA, Ireland, and Great Britain, but still quite a few. There's also a lot of people from Lebanon on that ship and a few from South Asia and even from Australia, okay? Because it's tied to a geodatabase, that's what makes these maps powerful, is if I click in different locations, just like the table I showed with all of you mapped, right? The ALL participants in the mapping course on the USA map, right? There was a database attached to it. There's a database attached to this as well, right? So I can see the grim details of, unfortunately, Mr. Lithman from this location here in Scotland did not survive. Okay, let me pan over to another location. Let's go to all passengers. Let's click on Denver. Who's this?
Molly Brown.
The unsinkable Molly Brown. So obviously Molly Brown survived and her record is in there as a record in that geodatabase. So remember there were 13, 17 passengers according to this particular data set that was mined for this particular story map. And fortunately, she was one of the survivors. But you can see that just like the symbology that I was using for our map of our, 25 participants in this course, here you've got 1,300 people mapped with a larger symbol symbolizing that there were more people from there. So as you probably would expect, there were quite a few people from London. Okay, so we've got this whole list of folks that were there. And just one last thing, that you probably know this, that it actually sailed to France for a time and then to Ireland before embarking on the voyage across the Atlantic. So why do I have the ocean's base map as the base map for this particular one? Well, because it's an ocean-based story, right? So it makes sense that we can change the base maps for these things, just like the this one here. We can say, well, you know what? I don't want that base map. I really want to maybe make the base map muted so I can really see the pattern of where people are. So I'm going to make a light gray base map here, and now I can see the pattern maybe a bit more clearly of our class participants. If I zoom out once more in this mapping platform, okay, now I've got a better sense maybe of the scattering of the folks here in the class. So it's the same tool and it's a different theme. So I like this Titanic map. I'm going to put it in the chat box as well. It's one of our early and I think one of the best Titanic or one of the best story maps that are out there. Yeah, in this case, this is only looking at the passengers. So but you're bringing up a good point there, Jim, that Jim messaged me. The point is, what if we made another one on the staff, the crew, etc., the officers? What was their survival rate? Don't know. Maybe that would be another good map to make. Are all of those, yeah, where there's probably a more concentration, right, of the staff. They probably weren't scattered from origins all over the world. They probably were a little bit more focused, as you're pointing out. Maybe there were a lot of people on that ship from Italy and from the UK, et cetera. So fascinating to be able to do this at your fingertips.